You're listening to Cottontail's podcast, part of the Silicon Valley Black Project, which produced the documentary film A Place at the Table about the Black pioneers of Silicon Valley. A Place at the Table can be viewed for rent on Vimeo.com on demand /A Place at the Table STEM. Through Cottontail's podcast, the Silicon Valley Black Project will continue to recognize the contributions made by African Americans. We will be featuring African American professionals, technologists in the fields of engineering, administration, and entrepreneurial pursuits from the past and present. Meet Joe Hargrove, an entrepreneur that has worked in many jobs and has had several careers throughout his life, all of them uniquely suited to different industries. Starting as a technical illustrator working for government facilities and high-tech companies, after attending a broadcast school, Joe became a Bay Area radio newsman during a historical time in the Bay Area. Joe currently owns and operates his own sign shop, providing signage and now PPE equipment for customers from Silicon Valley to the Central Valley of California. Well, first, can you tell me who is Joe Hargrove and where did he come from? Tell me that first.
Well, I grew up in Houston, Texas, and I came to California kind of on a whim in 1960. A couple of my buddies from Texas Southern University, we worked in janitorial services together, and we just decided we basically kind of flipped a coin and came to the West Coast rather than the East Coast. One of the guys had relatives out here, so that kind of influenced what we did too. So that's how we ended up here.
Okay. So what did you do when you first came? Did you go to college here? Did you go to radio training school? What did you do?
Well, we landed in Oakland, and one of the reasons we landed in Oakland was because one of the guys had relatives there. When I got here, the three of us went to work for the Alameda Naval Air Station in the shipping and receiving department. So we must have done that for 3 or 4 months, and then I moved down to East Palo Alto, and I enrolled at San Jose State University, majoring in art education.
Did you finish at San Jose State?
I did, in 1967.
1967, okay.
I was there for a while.
That's kind of a story of most of us. We had to fit it into our life. And, going to school full-time was not one of those things we could fit in that easy and earn a living.
You wanted to eat.
Yeah. So what was your first job coming out of San Jose State?
My first job was with Western Development Laboratories, Philco Ford. And I was a technical illustrator, and the work consisted mainly of doing organizational charts and schematics and that kind of thing. Nothing really artistic or creative, but for the $150 an hour, or was it less? It was. I have to do the math on that. It was probably about $1 an hour. I worked there for probably 2 years and 10 months, and that's how I ended up in the aerospace industry as a technical illustrator. And so, as they say, the rest is history with the art.
Mm-hmm. So the aerospace, was that Lockheed or Fairchild? Which one did you?
It was Philco Ford.
Philco Ford.
Western Development Laboratories. And Al and I have talked on a few occasions about the job shops. Well, I wasn't making too much money at Western Development Laboratories in the tech illustrating department, so we heard of something called job shops where you could go to work for somebody and you were basically a temp. You were a temporary employee, and they paid considerably more, but there were no benefits. So you could actually be hired to do a project 1 week, and the next week, if the project was finished, then you could be told that they no longer needed your services and you could just leave. And that happened quite a bit. Mm-hmm. So with that, I worked for Hewlett-Packard. I worked for Varian Associates. I worked for IBM. one of the things that was kind of interesting with that was I worked over in Vallejo for one of the projects, and I was going aboard a submarine doing a training manual, and I was just leaving Tennessee Street, which is one of the main streets in Vallejo. I'd go down about a mile, go down in the belly of the submarine and do drawings all day, and then at the end of the day, I'd be finished.
Which company was that?
That was with Applied Technology.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess Applied Technology had a contract, to do the service manuals. But I would do the drawings, and that would be a technical writer, and a lot of times we worked together. And over time, some of the customers started asking for specific teams. We went to different companies, to finish projects like that.
So that was a precursor to the temp services then?
That was the temp service.
Okay, was the temp.
That was the temp services, and we were making probably $1 more an hour than we would have made had we been captives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
it's probably $1 more an hour than I was making at Western Development Laboratories, Philco 4.
Mm-hmm. I've seen your artwork, so I know where that began. It's excellent work that you do, and also explains.
I might add that all of that was pretty technical,
mm-hmm.
and I guess later on, and I can't follow the time sequences as good as probably I should, but I worked at SRI, Stanford Research Institute, briefly doing the same kinds of technical drawings. And then from there, I went to Stanford University and worked in the publishing department. And if that sounds glamorous, it wasn't very glamorous. We would basically just do the layout for books that were published at Stanford University. It would probably be sometimes 64 pages on one galley, I think they called it. It would be folded multiple times and put in a machine for cutting, and those 64 pages would be like a 64-page book, and you put several of those together and you got a book.
Wow.
It was a very primitive way of publishing, but I learned a lot.
Yeah. Well, you learned to correlate if nothing else, huh?
Yes.
Now, how did you end up on the radio?
Well, I don't think it was something that hit me all at once, but I wanted to get into radio. I wanted to get into broadcasting. I found a school called the Ron Bailey School of Broadcast. I enrolled at the Ron Bailey School of Broadcast, and we learned how to read commercials and how to write script. And from there, I went to the College of San Mateo, and I took evening courses in radio and television production there. We did a show called the Spotlight News, in which we were on actual television for 3 nights a week. And I laugh about it because we had a script that we looked down at, and I talk about how you may not have gotten too much news, but you sure knew what the top of our heads looked like. We weren't looking up at the camera too much.
Is that right? That hadn't occurred to you. You were on live camera, huh?
Right. Okay. But anyway, that was very valuable.
Mm-hmm.
It was one of the high points of that brief period that I was at CSM. I did a show. I was the MC of a music show, and I had a rock group, I had a country and western group, and I had a soul group to come in and play. And one of the good things about KCSM was that it was actual television. It goes out into the community.
Mm.
It wasn't like closed circuit television where you learn, but you're learning from a closed circuit television outlet. So got a lot of valuable experience from that.
So that was like a public access station?
Yeah, it's I guess it was a community access station, but it was KCSM, the station for the College of San Mateo.
Okay.
I continued to go to the Ron Bailey School of Broadcast. Back then, you could send out tapes, and you sent them to different radio stations, and they would listen to them, and they would determine whether or not this is the sound that we like. You could get an interview, and a lot of times you could go in and they would give you a copy to read, or they would interview you and determine whether or not they wanted to hire you. When I finished the Ron Bailey School of Broadcast, I went out to Lake Tahoe. I found a job in Lake Tahoe at a station that was owned partly by one of the instructors, KNLT, Lake Tahoe, or Truckee. The station was actually in Truckee, but it was called a Lake Tahoe station. And I was on from midnight to 6 every day. The station was out of the reach of the owner, so I brought my own records in and would play my own records from midnight to 6 a.m. So I had kind of a little following out there. And eventually I came back to the Bay Area because I thought I was ready, and I went over to KDIA, and I kept asking them for jobs, and one day they said, well, come on in, you can work part-time, and that's how I ended up at KDIA.
Most radio people have a radio name. What was your radio name up at Tahoe?
If I tell you my radio name at Tahoe, will you promise not to ask about the circumstances of me going way out to Lake Tahoe in the first place?
No. Yeah, I promise. I won't ask. What was your Tahoe?
My name was Jason.
Jason. Well, that's pretty tame.
That was my radio name.
Jason what? Just Jason on the radio, huh?
Jason on the radio. This is Jason. I didn't even use a last name. I just used Jason.
Well, like Beyonce. I mean, there you are.
I didn't want some people in the Bay Area to know who I was in case they happened to be driving out there and hear me, and I didn't want them to be for certain who they were listening to.
Okay. I can tell this is going to be a conversation we're going to have.
Yes.
So,
yes.
All right. So then you get to KDIA. They hire you on. And who were you then?
Well, I used my name after that because I was doing something serious. I was in news at that point.
Okay.
KNLT in Lake Tahoe was a progressive rock station.
I see.
And I played music, and I was on from midnight to 6 a.m., and I didn't want to use my name. But when I came back to the Bay Area, I had a couple of really promising interviews. Do you remember Jack Hansen at KGO, the weatherman?
Yes, yes.
I did an audition for the weekend job at KGO. And the news director said, whoever I hire has to be ready to go. He said, they have to be ready to go because, he said, Pete Giddings hasn't had a vacation in months. So whoever I hire has to come in and go to work right away. And so I did one audition, and they said, well, after reviewing it, they said, your audition looked pretty good. Come back and do another audition. And, at that point, you're really excited. And I went back and did another audition. And then 3 weeks later, I got another call from KGO in San Francisco. And they said, come back, we want one more audition. And I went back, and the news director called me into his office, and he said, at this point, I'm not too sure who I'm going to hire. He said, it's between you and Jack Hansen. And he said, I'm not leaning one way or the other. He said, but when you come in, you're going to have to be able to do the work. So it was just an amazing job. I think it paid something like $1,200 a week for 2 days. Back then, you'd go in around 4 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. You'd prepare the weather. And then you'd be on the set to give the weather. And then after the newscast was over, you just go somewhere and have dinner or something and come back about 10 and prepare the 11 o'clock weather and do that. And then you were through. That was the extent of the work for a week.
Yeah. Were you on camera?
They ended up hiring Jack Hansen.
Oh, I was going to say, because I don't remember seeing Hargrove.
No, you didn't see Hargrove. Those suckers.
They just don't know. They had no idea what they were who they were letting go here. That's
and
shameful.
So after that, I thought, well, maybe I'm good enough to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And I doubled down on my efforts to get into KDIA, and I liked the format, and one of the news directors gave me a part-time job.
All right.
And I went to work as a news reporter, and I was terrible. I was awful. And Kathy, anybody that's gone through what it takes to become a radio announcer, if they don't tell you they were terrible when they first started, they're lying to you. We all are pretty bad.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why the stations like for you to go out to Monterey or go to Truckee or go to Watsonville or somewhere like that to learn how to be a broadcaster.
Mm-hmm.
I was fortunate enough to work at Major Market Radio at KDIA, and I hope too many people didn't hear me back at the beginning.
Tell me about your career at KDIA. Did you stay a newsman the whole time?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was a news person. I love news. I just loved it because there's always something going on. You can go in and it's just the quietest day in the world, and a bulletin will come over, and all of a sudden, all kinds of things are going on.
What was your first big news story at KDIA?
Oh, I guess it was right during the time that the Black Panthers were still pretty active.
Okay.
And one of the things, Huey Newton had such a good relationship with KDIA. I recall several times when he would be at the Alameda County Courthouse, he would be just getting out, and the press would go in and watch him come down, and there were these throngs of reporters there, and he'd look across these throngs of reporters, and he'd see KDIA, and he'd say, KDIA, hey, come on over. So I'd go over with my tape recorder, and Dennis Richmond, for instance, with his little shiny suit, would have to wait. And the reporters from the other radio stations and television stations would have to wait because he had a special association with KDIA, and he always gave us a chance to have the very first interview. So I tell these stories that a lot of times I would be on my way back to the station with my news report to produce and get on the radio, and he'd still be there going through interviews with some of the other people. So we had a special association with the Black Panthers.
Was there any time when you and Huey, say, had a personal conversation?
Several times, and there was a club in Oakland that a lot of people used to go to, and I'd go in from time to time, too, and I'd run into him, and he'd come up, Joe Hargrove, what's going on? What's happening, man? And so we'd talk. Mm-hmm. But at one point, I guess it was over at Jack London Square, there was a club that was pretty popular. I went in there with some white people at one point. They were pretty badly informed people, I guess. Mm-hmm. I probably shouldn't have been with them anyway. And Huey was at the bar, and I said, oh, there's Huey. And they made some kind of statement about, oh, wow, he doesn't look that bad to me, or something to that effect. Mm-hmm. And I said, oh, wait a minute, let me get up from here. So I got up and went up to the bar, and Huey and I, talked for a long time, and he'd say, there's some talent up in here. Oh, one other thing that I thought about, Jessica Mitford, the author, Jessica Mitford, when the Black Panthers were really popular. Mm-hmm. Jessica Mitford lived on Ashby in Berkeley. Uh-huh. And Jane Fonda had been invited there. And the station sent me over to do an interview with Jane Fonda at Jessica Mitford's house on Ashby. You know the high rise there in Oakland overlooking the bay,
right.
Overlooking the lake, rather.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Well, she used to go there quite a bit. So one of the high points of my early broadcasting experience was being sent there to interview Jane Fonda and listen to her talk about her support for the Black Panthers. And, she's been an activist forever.
Right.
Who's the other one? I guess at the Circle Star, what's her name? The first time ever I met you? Roberta Flack.
Roberta Flack, yeah, okay. There it is.
The station picked up a tab for me to go to the Circle Star and go behind the curtain and interview Roberta Flack. Mm-hmm. So, and I guess if I keep thinking, I'll think of some of the earlier ones.
But you mentioned in one of the emails something about
Penny Hurst. Can I tell you how all of that came about?
Yes, you certainly can.
Okay. In 1970, the Oakland School District needed a new superintendent of public instruction. And one of the applicants was Dr. Marcus Foster, mm-hmm. and he was an educator from Philadelphia. Yes. Mm-hmm. Dr. Marcus Foster was high school principal, and he was an assistant superintendent of the public schools in Philadelphia. I guess it was November 6th of 1973, conducted a school board meeting, and he and his assistant, Robert Blackburn, after the meeting was over, left and went out to the parking lot to get in their cars and go wherever they were going to go. And all of a sudden, there was a burst of gunfire. Somebody was firing automatic weapons at them. So Dr. Marcus Foster was assassinated. Mm-hmm. And nobody knew why. Nobody knew who was responsible. They didn't have a motive. The Oakland Police Department conducted a rather vigorous investigation. And for weeks, nothing came up. And then after about, I guess, a couple of weeks, somebody took responsibility called the Symbionese Liberation Army. We had never heard of the Symbionese Liberation Army. And so I guess the Oakland police were able to, come up with a motive. The purpose or the motive was supposed to have been that the superintendent and the Oakland School District had plans of putting police on every campus in Oakland, which was a false story. Mm-hmm. Part of that story also was that the school district wanted to give the students identification cards, so they'd have to carry these identification cards around all the time. That, too, was a false story. And so the investigation continued, trying to determine who this SLA, who the Symbionese Liberation Army was. Mm-hmm. And nobody could really tell. I think a lot of people speculated that it started at the University of California, Berkeley, which was a good place to start, where a lot of kind of left-wing things started. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I guess a short time later, I don't know how much later, but two people took responsibility for the assassination. They were Joseph Romero and Russell Little, and they were members of the Symbionese Liberation Army. And they said that, that they did the assassination, and they gave their purpose again, saying that the Oakland School Board had plans to put police on campus and also to require students to carry identification cards. And it was something that KDIA was not unlike a lot of the black radio stations across the country. I'm sure you've heard them. We had a format where most of what we did was music, but we were pretty proud in the news department. We had 4 new news cars, 4 new Chryslers, and with my limited art background at that point, I put the KDIA news on the side. So,
all right.
Yeah. So anyway, this was such a big story, and our demographic was mainly the black community. And so we all sat around in the news department trying to determine what the SLA was all about. Who is this group called the SLA? And one person in the news department who had been there for quite some time said, I think it's an African group. I think that person was thinking Simba or something like that.
Okay.
You know?
Yeah.
And I said, I think it's from the word symbiosis. I think it's the living together amicably of dissimilar things in the environment.
Right.
And I happen to be right. The Symbionese Liberation Army came from the word symbiosis, which meant the interdependence of different species, suggesting a union of classes and races. Mm-hmm. And as you probably guessed, it did start right over there in Berkeley at the University of California. There were a lot of precursors to the Symbionese Liberation Army. There was the free speech movement, Mario Savio, the free speech movement, the filthy speech movement. It was just a haven for a lot of leftist radical groups. We found out a little bit more about the Symbionese Liberation Army. It was mostly young white kids from well-to-do families and one or two black people in the group. Well, the leader of the group was well known in the correctional departments in the state of California here. Donald DeFreeze, as I said, he had been in and out of prisons for most of his adult life. He was the black guy that was in the group. Donald DeFreeze reportedly came from a very abusive background, and you've heard that before. Yeah. And so he took on the name Sin Q. Sin Q was the nom de guerre for the guy who had started the uprising in 1839 on the slave ship Amistad. He was the one who successfully revolted on that ship. So Sin Q was the leader of the group. Joseph Romero and Russell Little were still, they were still running around. There were several other members, Bill and Emily Harris. February 4th, 1974. Gunmen went into Patricia Hearst's second-floor apartment in Berkeley. They stormed in, they knocked her around, they beat her up, they blindfolded her, and threw her in the trunk of a car. And these were members of the Symbionese Liberation Army. Also, her boyfriend, Stephen Weed, was there. And he was knocked around. And since this is on the second floor, he was knocked over onto the staircase and rolled down, and he managed to get away. The Symbionese Liberation Army held Patty Hearst in a closet, blindfolded for several days. I don't know the exact time. Mm-hmm. But they held her for a number of days, and she reported later on being abused and beaten and raped. What eventually happened was that the Stockholm Syndrome,
right, mm-hmm.
where the captive eventually goes to the side of the captors. And so Patty Hearst eventually did that. She was told to send a communique to her parents, to William Randolph Hearst, who the wealthy publisher of the San Francisco Examiner, demanding $6 million for a food giveaway program, and there were negotiations back and forth. Now, there were 3 stations in Oakland that got communiques. It was our station, KDIA, KSAN, and KPFA in Berkeley. And so the SLA would kind of alternate back and forth on who they would send the communiques to. We'd have kids call every once in a while. Hey, this is the SLA. Play some James Brown.
Oh, my.
So we'd say something like, get off of the phone. One day, one of the guys who'd been in news for quite a while, and after you've done this for a while, you kind of have a sixth sense for some things that are really going on and what's really authentic. He came to me and he said, hey, Joe, he said, I got a call that there's a communique for us at Zim's restaurant in San Francisco there on Van Ness. He said, I think this one's authentic. I think it's real. We were the only two on duty. We had a small news department. And so he says, just kind of watch things. Hold on, I'm going to run over to San Francisco and see if I can get the communique. So he got in the news car, went over the Bay Bridge, went to the second floor, as he had been instructed to the men's bathroom, looked behind the tank, and there was no tape. So he came back, and he was rather crestfallen because he said, you know what? He said, I don't miss many of these, but I could have sworn that was really what that was, that it was from the SLA.
Yeah.
Well, a half hour later, we got a call from Charles Bates, head of the FBI special agent in San Francisco, telling us they picked up the tape. And if we wanted a copy of the tape, we could have a copy of the tape.
Did you get a copy?
We did. We finally got a copy of it.
So
but with regards to the food giveaway program, it was really a circus because the Hearst Foundation, William Randolph Hearst and his people, did actually come up with about $6 million worth of food. And large trucks came to one of the local parks, and we at our station gave all of the information about how you could go over and you'd get a box of food, get a big bag of food. But it turned out to be a total farce because there were people there with trucks grabbing 15 and 20 bags at a time, loading them on their trucks. So I think the people who really needed the food, I guess they got some food, but they really abused the process, let's put it like that. And there was Patty Hearst in there with her new nom de guerre, Tanya. And Tanya was Che Guevara's wife. And they took a lot of their rhetoric from South American terrorist groups, and so Tanya was Ron Guevara's wife. I think it's Ron Guevara. Yeah. And so anyway, she was brandishing a weapon, and so she was a bank robber. She actually joined her captor. The SLA had several robberies, and she continued to put pressure on society at large in support of the SLA and the leftist dogma that they were putting out there. I think it was January 10th, 1974. Joseph Romero and Russell Little were arrested. And they were just riding along, chilling, as they say. Yes. And the police saw them, and they looked suspicious, and the police pulled them over, and there was a brief shootout. Nobody got shot, but Joseph Romero and Russell Little were finally arrested for the assassination of Dr. Marcus Foster.
And we did solve that crime.
Yes, right. I guess it must have been May of 1974. Most of the SLA, which consisted then of probably about 8 or 10 members, but most of them went down to Los Angeles. They always wanted to rent places that were in poor neighborhoods, in mostly black neighborhoods. And one of the reasons for doing that was because they figured that if anything went down, they would get a lot of support from black people. So on May 17th, they were in South Central Los Angeles in a little safe house there. And one of the SLA members had gone into Mel's Sporting Goods. Remember that?
Yes, I do.
Yes.
Had gone into Mel's Sporting Goods, and he was caught shoplifting. And they were attempting to hold him until the authorities came, and a fist fight broke out, and he ran out, and there was a van outside, and guess who was in the van? Patricia Hearst.
Okay, yes.
And she fired at the building. She fired at the building. Whichever member was in the SLA went a separate way, and they went to this house in South Central Los Angeles, but they were followed there by the police. And a shootout. They said one of the most massive shootouts in LA history took place. And eventually, I guess the police, threw some kind of percussion grenade into the house, and the house burned up.
Right.
And 6 SLA members perished in that fire, which, for the most part, was just about the end.
Right.
Excuse me, just about the end of the SLA.
So how did Patty avoid that fire, though?
The guy that was attempting to do some shoplifting got in a van and went to that house. They followed him to that house, and she went in a different direction.
I see. Okay.
And,
lucky for her.
September 18th, she was arrested. The prosecution had a very difficult time because the defense, and remember F. Lee Bailey?
Yes.
F. Lee Bailey was her defense attorney.
Yep.
And he did a pretty good job of convincing the jury and convincing the court that she had been forced into what she was doing and she didn't voluntarily join the SLA. But she was sentenced to 35 years in prison, and she served only 2 years. And Jimmy Carter pardoned her, and Clinton released her.
Yes, she's had a family and married. She married her bodyguard, I think. Wasn't it a bodyguard?
She married one of her bodyguards who was a police officer.
Right.
A part-time police officer. He was a bodyguard.
So you also mentioned in an email to me that your station was one of the first to find out about Jim Jones in Guyana. Tell me about your career at KDIA. Did you stay a newsman the whole time?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was a news person. I love news. I just loved it because there's always something going on. You can go in and it's just the quietest day in the world, and a bulletin will come over, and all of a sudden, all kinds of things are going on. Well, I mentioned a couple of minutes ago that you kind of have a sixth sense for things. This was in 1978.
Yeah.
And Congressman Leo Ryan and his fact-finding mission had gone to Jonestown at the request of a lot of the Bay Area families. And these were families who had people to join Jim Jones, cult, and eventually went to Jonestown with him to this jungle outpost, looking for utopia.
Right.
And while they were over there, some of them didn't like the way things were going. They thought they were being abused, and so they sent back here to their families, to the Fillmore District and to East Palo Alto and to Vallejo and to Hunters Point, asking their families to look into their situation over in Jonestown. And so they finally talked Congressman Leo Ryan into going to Jonestown and talking to the families, and he went one weekend and he had a very good meeting with them, and when he was leaving, some of them tried to get on the truck that had brought them from the airstrip out to the jungle outpost, and they were pulled off by members of Jim Jones' team. And so when Jim Jones had done his little conference with a lot of the families, and they were getting ready to board the plane, and the attack came. And Jim Jones was shot. One of the reporters who had gone was shot and killed. Another one was wounded, and Jackie Steer was wounded. And so that was on a Saturday night. And my radio station didn't do news on Sunday.
Okay.
We didn't do news on Sunday. We did the gospel show early in the morning.
Yeah.
And then we would do public affairs in the afternoon. And so I picked up the paper on Sunday morning. This was November 27th of 1978. Sound about right?
Right.
And so I picked up the paper and I saw that Congressman Leo Ryan had been killed attempting to leave the airport. And I just had this feeling that all hell was going to break loose. And so I went into the radio station and I started looking at the wire copy that had accumulated over the night, called the American Embassy in Georgetown. And I spoke with a spokesman there, and he said, Mr. Hargrove, let me assure you that you're one of the first reporters I've talked to in the country, and that as we speak, murders and suicides are taking place in Jonestown.
Wow.
Wow.
Did you break in on the radio station and let that information be known? Was that your next move?
Did I ever?
Did you ever?
Did I ever? Bob Jones was on the air, so I turned the monitor up and I ran over and told him I got to put this on tape. And I heard Bob Jones say, Joe Hargrove is standing by in the news department with a special report from Georgetown, Guyana. And so we interrupted the program and I put it on, and so we made the announcement, and before long, the news department was teaming with general managers, news department director, manager, program director, and several of the reporters called, and they asked, what can we do to help you with this story?
Wow.
So one of the reporters, I said, go over to the People's Temple on Geary Street in San Francisco. So that reporter went over there, and when she got there, fist fights had broken out between some of the people who didn't want their relatives to go and others who had said it was okay. One of the other reporters asked me, what do you want me to do? I said, see if you can get Willie Brown on the phone, because Willie Brown was one of the people who didn't have any problem with Jim Jones. Of course, to his credit, not everybody knew what Jim Jones was like.
No.
But they should have had it indicated. Anyway, it was one person working on local reaction on the phone. Another person was over at the People's Temple on Geary Street. And so we just did a whole show covering what had happened in Jonestown. But again, I just felt that Sunday morning when I got up that, all hell's getting ready to break loose.
You could feel it coming, huh?
You could feel it coming. And it was kind of warm that time of the year, and it was really a terrible sight to see 912 bloated bodies lying in the heat in Jonestown.
Who took the footage of that?
Probably had it had to have been a surveillance plane that flew over.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
I got that.
And anyway, so I found out about that's what happened with the Jonestown.
And you also were involved with when George Moscone, the former mayor of San Francisco, the late George Moscone, and Harvey Milk. What will you tell us about that? Well,
I covered the reaction to the life sentence given to Dan White. And what that was all about. And ironically, that was in the same year. That was in the same month in the same year.
Wow.
In November of 1978. And what had happened was that Dan White had been appointed by George Moscone to the Board of Supervisors. He was a former San Francisco police officer and a former firefighter. And Dan White decided that he no longer wanted to be a supervisor, so he resigned. Well, after a while, after a couple of weeks, he decided, I want my job back. And at that point, George Moscone said, wait a minute, you can't have your job back. And he was a little bit upset over that. And, actually, he was pretty upset over that.
Yeah.
And so at one point, one day, he crawled into a side window. I think it must have been a weekend, and he knew that Harvey Milk and George Moscone were there. And he crawled into a side window and went to George Moscone's office and shot him. And then he went down the hall and shot and killed Harvey Milk. So anyway, Dan White was arrested and charged with murdering George Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk. And there was a trial, and he was charged with manslaughter, which was a light sentence for such a terrible crime. And he claimed that eating sugar, eating sweet stuff, eating Twinkies, and he had diminished capacity as a result of eating that junk, eating junk food. He was sentenced to this ridiculously light. He was given this ridiculously light sentence, and I think he served something. I don't remember the sentence, but he he was out in 2 years and 5 months or something like that. And so particularly the gay community was not happy with that at all. And so there were demonstrations in San Francisco. And I went to San Francisco to cover the demonstrations for my station. At one point, I saw 7 police cars with the sirens going and burning up. Burning right there on Grove Street. And several people had attempted to kick in the door to City Hall, but it was a real vociferous protest.
And that was called White Night, right?
White Night riots. Those were the White Night riots. And so, anyway, I guess it was, 1985 that Dan White went to his house and went in the garage and ran a hose from his exhaust into the car and committed suicide.
Can't imagine it happened to a better guy. I mean,
Right. A more deserving guy.
Right, or maybe he'd had a Twinkie that day. You never know.
Yeah.
So also you told me about a young black security guard who discovered Nixon's the Watergate thing, the Democratic National Headquarters break-in?
Yes.
What about, how'd you meet him?
Well, I didn't really meet him. I interviewed him from Washington, D.C.
Oh, okay.
What would happen, Nixon resigned from the White House August 7th or 8th of 1974. Okay. And so what would happen is that every year, radio stations go back and they talk about what happened a year ago, or 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, whatever the case was. And a lot of news people are notoriously lazy. And we had a news service that we'd get every day. We had audio from the Associated Press that came in of the top stories from Washington, D.C., or anywhere else in the world. They'd come in the morning, mid-morning, and we could just pull off those stories and use them as we needed in our own newscasts. So what would happen was that every year I noticed a pattern. Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Mitchell, and Dean. Statements from Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Mitchell, and Dean. And so I thought, oh, this is crazy. So I contacted some of my sources in Washington, D.C., and I said, can you find Frank Wells? And they said, yeah, he was around here a few minutes ago. I said, can you get him to the phone? And they said, yeah. They said, give me a number, and what's your radio affiliation? I said, well, it's KDIA, and here's my phone number. Call him when you find him. So they found him, and they took him to the NAACP office in Washington, D.C. And what had happened was he was a young security guard, and he was making his rounds in the Watergate. And right adjacent to the stairs, there was the Democratic National Headquarters. And as he was making his rounds, he noticed that one of the doors to Democratic National Headquarters was ajar. So he went over and just pulled it open. It should have been locked. So he just went over and pulled it open, and there was duct tape over the plunger, that should have locked the door. So he didn't think too much of it. He pulled the tape off and continued to make his rounds. And whoever had put the tape there came while he was making his rounds and put more tape on it. And so he said at that point, this is crazy. So he called the Washington, what is it called in D.C., the Metro Police?
Yeah, I think so.
He called Metro, and in a matter of minutes, the place was teeming with police officers. And so that was the beginning of the Watergate break-in.
Right.
And it turned out, the whole story, it turned out that Nixon had authorized the break-in.
Right.
And these guys were called plumbers because they were supposed to stem any leaks and give them a little better assurance of Nixon staying in office after a lot of the malfeasance that had gone on. And so Frank Wells I had a great deal of difficulty interviewing him because he was just downtrodden and distraught over the whole thing. He felt that history had passed him up. And guess what? History had passed him up.
Mm.
It was Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Mitchell, and Dean. It was Rosemary. What was Rosemary's name? Rosemary Woods. It was everybody except Frank Wills. And Frank Wills was the person who discovered the break-in and changed history. He had all kinds of problems. He couldn't get a job. They were going to do a book, and he could put his name in it. That never happened. They never did anything to compensate him for changing history. Anyway, I was kind of disappointed to hear that he died in 1985.
Oh.
And I always felt that he died of a broken heart. Some of my sources told me that Leon Jaworski was in Houston and that he was practicing law. And so I called Judge Leon Jaworski in Houston, and his secretary came on, and she asked me who it was, and I said, this is Joe Hargrove. I'm calling from KDIA Radio. Mm-hmm. And she said, well, hold on, Mr. Hargrove. He will know why you're calling. Mm. He said, oh, Mr. Hargrove, let me tell you this. I know why you're calling. Or something like that. Mm. So one of the questions, my first question to him, and I think you'll find this interesting, I asked him, what is the likelihood that this could happen again? And his answer was, not likely, which kind of surprised me. He said, not likely. And I said, well, why? He said, because the checks and balances of our system are so complete that it's very unlikely that anything like this could happen again.
Mm-hmm. Boy, was he wrong. It just seemed a glimpse into the mindset of the Republican Party, or at least the body politic, how they actually work, how they spy on each other and they do underhanded tricks to get an advantage, and they just happen to be caught that. We find the Democrats are probably doing the same kind of thing.
This thirst for power.
Yes.
This thirst for power. And it seems to me that they will do anything to have that power. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But it was who was the first special Watergate prosecutor? John Sirica. And then there was Archibald Cox and the Midnight Massacre.
Right.
The Saturday Night Massacre. And then there was Judge Leon Jaworski. But it's surprising, he was still practicing law in Houston, had gone back to practicing law in Houston. I loved it. There was never a dull moment. There were a lot of disappointments. I had Willie Mays' home phone number, and I would hear him on the radio talking about something, and I'd call him at home, and he'd say, I don't want to talk. I don't want to talk. Okay, Willie, I'll throw your number away. When you work as a reporter, people tell you things.
Yeah.
And, you have your sources, and I found it very important to protect those sources. I would never give, even as public as Leon Jaworski was, I wouldn't give another reporter his number.
Yeah. How long was it before you started your own company using your graphics design and artistic talents?
30 years.
No kidding. So you left broadcasting 30 years ago?
Yes.
Why?
There was no place to go.
Okay.
There was no place to go. I had tried. It's a subjective thing. It's been fun. Mm. It's been fun. And I've always told young people to do as many different things as you possibly can. Live a diverse life. And people are fascinating, too. I really find people fascinating. Sometimes I'm just talking with people, and I find it really, really fascinating just to talk to them and find out what they're doing and all. But I don't know. I think that my experience in radio is just great.
Okay.
I could always draw, and one of the things I didn't mention was that when I was at Stanford as art director for the Stanford University Press, I illustrated some textbooks, and and you and Al saw those text excerpts from the textbooks, but I illustrated the textbooks for the American Anthropology Department, and I didn't necessarily want to be an illustrator because I didn't know that I could make a good living at it. So I started the sign business, and I think I'm happier being a sign maker, doing LED signage.
Okay.
Let me tell you a little something about LEDs. LEDs, there were 3 Japanese physicists. And finally, they figured out how to make blue, won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2014 for inventing a blue diode. And when they invented that blue diode, they could make white, and it opened the floodgates, and it just created all kind of havoc for you when you go down and try to find the right LED light. Think of it, Kathy. They're everywhere. They're in your watches. They're in your. They make your televisions bright. They're in your phone. LEDs are in your phone, and none of that could take place had it not been for LEDs. They're called light-emitting diodes.
Joe, I can't thank you enough for this interview. Yours is one of those unique stories that people just won't have. They just don't have the insight or the opportunity to be close to those events at all. And hopefully,
well, I have to admit I was a little apprehensive about what would happen, and I did jot down a few notes in a couple of days.
I know you did. I really appreciate this, Joe. I really do.
Well, thanks for asking me.
Thank you, Joe Hargrove, for the historical glimpse of some of the events that shaped the lives of many of us in the Bay Area. And thank you for listening.